I'm Mehdi Hasan. Welcome to another live broadcast from the Intercept. I'm joining you from my home. It's up. It's now, I think, more than 40,000 deaths here in the US in the space of just a few weeks, lest we forget. President Donald Trump last night made his go-to move when he's flailing in a crisis and doesn't know what to do: attacking immigrants. Last night, he put out a tweet claiming that he was going to sign an executive order suspending all immigration into the United States. Given the number of tests in the US, given the number of confirmed cases, perhaps people around the world should be banning Americans from immigrating into their countries. But that phrase, this threat of his about immigration, is because it's a classic move by nationalists, authoritarians, the far right across the globe. When in trouble, when in political trouble, blame the other, blame the immigrants for bringing in disease, demonize foreigners, point towards scary-looking minority communities and say they are the threat. And one leader who perfected that move long before Donald Trump even emerged on the scene politically is actually his BFF from the world's largest democracy, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. On today's broadcast, I want to talk about how Modi and his far-right BJP governing party have used the coronavirus crisis, this global pandemic, to go after both Muslims and the media. I also want to talk about capitalism and the coronavirus, and who better to talk about both of these issues with than the acclaimed, the iconic Indian writer, winner of numerous awards, including the Man Booker Prize, the Sydney Peace Prize, my good friend Arundhati Roy, who joins me now live from New Delhi. Arundhati, how are you?
All right, Mehdi, all right. Thank you for that introduction.
Well, so let me kick off by asking you a question I ask all guests on the show before we get to the politics and the meat of the substance of the discussion. How are you? How are you doing? Are you safe and well? Are you able to practice social distancing in New Delhi right now?
Well, you know, that word social distancing has somewhat horrible connotations in India, because social distancing is something that a community, a people that practices caste understands in awful ways, you know. So we try to find another word for it, and let's say physical distancing. And in India, as in many poor countries, you know, social distancing, physical distancing, it is for the people who have homes, for the middle and upper classes. For poorer people, a lockdown is physical compression. You know, you have Dharavi in Mumbai, a slum in which almost 1 million people live in 2 square kilometers. Off the main roads of Delhi, people are crammed into, you know, little spaces. So it's a rather cruel understanding of what a lockdown is, really.
I want to come back to the lockdown in a moment. Just very quickly on the Indian numbers, the COVID-19 numbers out of India, the world's second most populous country, a country of more than 1 billion people. The numbers are surprisingly low, less than 20,000 cases, much less than 1,000 deaths total so far. Should we believe those numbers?
Well, I don't know that you can believe the numbers anywhere, you know, because from whatever I read and see and look at, which is, you know, not less or more than a lot of people, but it feels as though all these statistics are built like on a foundation, which is a floating mattress on a very choppy sea. Everything is moving, you know. Are the virus strains the same in the US and in India? Does climate play a part in it? You know, what about the levels of testing? Of course, they're very low here. You know, they're saying 80% of the tests are asymptomatic, and therefore perhaps, you know, both in the US and in India, many more people have it than we think. So I think we're all swimming around in a kind of COVID haze, where we really don't know exactly what's going on. But increasingly, studies do seem to suggest that perhaps in in India for sure that there's a lot of asymptomatic cases, which is good news
So
and bad news because it means the morbidity is much less. But a lot more people have it than we think, and so on.
So right now, India is under lockdown. You've called it, quote, the world's biggest, most punitive lockdown, and you say it's doing, quote, the exact opposite of what it was meant to achieve. Explain to our viewers around the world what you mean by that.
What I mean by that is, that the Prime Minister came out at 8 o'clock one day, 8 o'clock in the evening, and gave a country of 1.38 billion people 4 hours to lock themselves in.
Wow.
Mass transport stopped, everything was closed. And suddenly you saw a situation in which the working class of India, which are millions and millions of people who had been, over the years really pushed out of the villages and came to the cities as huge pools of cheap labor to work on construction sites, to work on these small, cramped, live in these small, cramped, medieval Dickensian tenements and work in the garment business or as carpenters or as tailors or whatever. And suddenly, at the end, it was the end of the month. It was the last week of the month. They hadn't received their pay. The landlords were not going to let them not pay their rent. So the morning after the lockdown was announced, millions of people just started to walk for miles and miles and miles, like 100 miles, 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers, 800 kilometers home because they had no money, they had no food. They had nothing to do. And I actually realized that there was something tectonic happening in the city, So I went out with a media pass that I have, and I walked with some of them right to the border and of Delhi and Uttar Pradesh. I spoke to many of them. It was unbelievable. It was as though the government hadn't imagined that it was a government for poor people. Everything in the language, in the direction was addressed to the middle class. Come out onto your balconies and bang your pots and pans and so on. People don't have balconies. People don't have food. People don't have anywhere to stay. They were beaten, these people, as they were walking because they were, violating the curfew. Not just beaten, but humiliated, made to frog jump, made to assume this position of what is called murga in Hindi, where you bend down and hold your ears. And of course, you must have seen the videos of some of them being hosed down with chemical spray. They walked to their villages. Some of them got there and were not allowed in. Others were stopped on the way and held in detention camps, which they are in, whatever they're called, quarantine camps, where they still are. There are millions of people who have no food, who have no money, who have sold their telephones, can't contact families.
It's so crazy to hear you talking about these. No, I'm saying it's so crazy to hear you talk about these stories because right now I'm in the US, in Washington, D.C., where Congress is right now trying to pass another quote unquote stimulus bill where they're arguing about, the level of how high the checks should be, how high the unemployment insurance should be, what level of support small businesses should get, how much money is there to spare to support people with, all sorts of problems. And yet you have a country like India where there was no real safety net to begin with, no real welfare state of any kind of, Western or industrialized form. And then you get all these people, as you say, losing their jobs with absolutely no financial support. So there in India, a lockdown literally means starvation.
It means starvation. I mean, today I was looking at videos of places where, there are these places where food is being distributed and there are stampedes. People are trampling over children with their, plates to get food. You have queues which are miles long. This, and we don't know the stories. We don't know the contours of this tragedy yet. We have a crisis of hunger. We have a crisis of hatred. We have a crisis of unemployment, and we have a massive health crisis outside of COVID. So when people ask me, has this virus done? I think it's like an X-ray. It just exposes the bare bones of the system. It amplifies the terrible things that we have done and the terrible inequalities we have accepted, and it just puts them on display. That is what has happened here in India.
You mentioned the crisis of hatred. A lot of people, including me for the Intercept, have written pieces in recent weeks about how Islamophobes in places like India and beyond have tried to use this pandemic to demonize and scapegoat Muslim minority communities. In India, you have Hindu nationalists accusing Muslims of deliberately spreading the virus as part of some sort of anti-Hindu conspiracy. There are cries of Corona jihad. You have Indian Muslims being lynched by far-right mobs. How bad is the situation on the ground for Muslims there right now, given this pandemic? Because you were heavily criticized recently for suggesting the situation is even, quote, approaching genocidal, your words.
So, you see, just like the situation of hunger and health was already in crisis before the coronavirus hit, so was the case of the attack on Muslims, the Islamophobia. I mean, I've spoken to you about it before, and I've written extensively about it for years. But just prior to the arrival of the virus, the first case arrived on January 30th. But in December, the government had passed a new anti-Muslim citizenship law. And so the whole country was in turmoil. You had thousands of protests, nonviolent protests, led by Muslim women, mostly, And in some places, there were 1 million people on the street protesting against what everybody saw as a dismantling of the Indian constitution. Now, in the middle of that, there was an election in Delhi in February. The BJP came out with the most virulent anti-Muslim campaign you can imagine, where you had, big BJP leaders coming out on the street chanting, "Desh ke gaddaron ko goli maro salon ko," which means, what shall we do with the traitors? Why don't we just shoot the bastards? Basically, this was the chant. They lost the elections. And somehow, in order to punish people, Muslims, obviously, there was this huge attack in northeast Delhi, a vigilante attack of right-wing Hindus backed by the police. There was a massacre, and the bodies were still being taken out of the drains. Of course, the Muslims fought back because they were expecting it. The atmosphere was so vitiated. And while these bodies were being pulled out of the drains, while this horrific scenario of poor people's homes burnt, thousands living in graveyards in refugee camps, began the first. Trump was here at the time when the massacres were going on just a few kilometers. He was
turning a deliberate blind eye.
Yeah, they as usual hugged each other. There were 100,000 people in the stadium to greet him in Ahmedabad. There was 1 million people on the streets. All that happened while we knew that Corona had already arrived. As late as the 13th of March, the health ministry was saying it's not an emergency. And when the lockdown was called, before that happened, the Tablighi Jamaat, which is a pretty fundamentalist Islamist sect, they had a meeting of thousands of people in a place called Nizamuddin, very, very close to where I live, not even 10, 15 minutes away. Now, this meeting happened before the lockdown was called. When the lockdown was called, all these people were still in this very narrow, crowded area. They dispersed and they turned out to be a super spreader of Corona. Well, a super spreader insofar as they were now being tracked down and tested. So therefore, obviously, the statistics would be such. But at that same time, there were larger meetings in Hindu temples. All of that was going on. And yet they started to be called human bombs. Corona jihadis. Even now, this is going on, and
Yeah.
then a campaign, on WhatsApp and on TV, where Muslims were being charged with deliberately spreading Corona. There's this horrible story I was just reading today of, hospitals, of course, earlier have said Muslims can't come, or first they have to be tested for COVID, or Muslims are separated into different wards. Today there was a story of a young pregnant Muslim woman in Jharkhand who went to a hospital, and this is her account of it, that she was beaten with slippers, and when she was bleeding they told her, you clean the floor, and finally she lost her child. Now, the Indian mainstream media has been very, very complicit in this profiling. And the reason I said
Yes.
the situation is approaching genocidal is because any scholar of history, the history of genocide, will tell you genocide isn't something that just happens one Sunday morning.
Yeah.
There's a huge
Yeah.
cultural preparation that takes place, where a whole community is dehumanized, is profiled, is like in the 1930s, how the Nazis used typhus to stigmatize the Jews, and to
Yeah. The bringing of disease is a very particular angle to that demonization.
Similarly, the Home Minister, when he was bringing in the anti-Muslim citizenship bill, referred to Bangladeshi Muslim immigrants as termites. So I'm talking about a cultural preparation, which we really must take account of. And it's impossible uh, to live here and to have to watch this and listen to this propaganda night and day from television channels and hate groups on WhatsApp
Arundhati,
without feeling terrified.
what do you say to your critics, including some Indian Muslims as well, who I hear say, come on, Arundhati, we're nowhere near genocidal, and you can't get rid of India's Muslims, even if you tried, 200 million Indians, almost a fifth of the population. They say we have safety in numbers. It's bad here, but it's nowhere near as bad as you're suggesting. What do you say to them?
It's not, I'm not saying that when you use that word, it's not that you're saying, okay, all 200 million are going to be wiped off the map. I'm talking about an impulse, that already the citizenship law with the National Register of Citizens, the building of detention centers, the suggestion that there will be a hierarchical citizenship where some people have more rights than others, and then this profiling. It is a very, very dangerous scenario where Muslims are in danger on the streets, Muslim vegetable vendors, Muslim people just walking down the road getting lynched.
Lynchings are more and more common.
Yes, and the thing is that there's no point keeping quiet about something until it happens. So now you have to give, and people like me have been talking about it for many years, the coming of this, and it has been coming and coming and coming and coming. So there'll always be those people saying, oh, it's not that bad. But is that really the way to react to such an alarming situation, whose progression from, just a few days ago, you had millions of people, hundreds of people, or thousands of people, women, Muslim women out on the streets saying that we will not go home because for us, our futures hang in the balance because of this new law you're bringing. And suddenly the coronavirus has everyone home, into their homes. All of them are isolated. The people who are seen to have organized the protests are being rapidly arrested. Students, intellectuals, activists being pushed into overcrowded jails. And we have to sit around saying, oh, it's not that bad. I'm not saying genocide is happening now. I'm just saying, look at the speed at which this profiling is happening of a whole community. Let us pay
Well,
attention to that process.
I'm glad you're saying it because someone needs to. And we shouldn't forget them. Another issue which you speak about a lot and you get attacked for, the people of Kashmir, India's only Muslim majority state, have been under their own special form of lockdown or siege since last August. A massive military crackdown, mass detentions, curfews, checkpoints, a block on the internet, a media blackout. So do we know, Arundhati, how Kashmiris are coping with the coronavirus, especially in the packed jails there?
Well, in Kashmir, I think the problems of these overcrowded slums and the kind of physical compression that I'm talking about doesn't exist in Kashmir. So that's a good thing. But they are suffering from other things, which is, if you like, a double lockdown, because they were locked down after Article 370 was abrogated, and now they are locked down in a way which perhaps perhaps they don't mind the lockdown, the corona lockdown, as much as they mind the political and military lockdown,
Yes.
But today, there was news of, a young photojournalist and another journalist being charged under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. And you have a great sense of fear and isolation there, because while the lockdown is happening, the authoritarian, totalitarian movement isn't locked down by any means. It's moving fast to change laws in Kashmir, the domicile laws, all the things that they feared are being put into place now as everyone is forced to stay at home. It's a very, very frightening scenario that faces the whole world, not just India, but the whole world, where a whole move, but we happen to have this situation of corona in a digital age when half the world is ruled by low IQ, authoritarian people, and they are moving to put in surveillance, to make us prisoners of this, like digital handcuffs, if you like, to remove every form of dignity and volition from society. And we really have to worry about this. That's why I wrote in this piece called "The Pandemic is a Portal," that there's a portal through which we are moving now. And on the one hand, you have people whose solution to this problem is to deepen the injustice. While the pandemic is on, Donald Trump has given permission for mining on the moon. He owns the moon, of course, we know that, but it's not owned by poets and lovers, it's owned by Trump. But so privatization, the extreme forms of capitalism and digital surveillance are going to be put in place really quickly. Whereas I think huge sections of the population of the world incarcerated in their homes now are probably thinking that this is the time to rethink this whole machine. But how do we take power when we are locked up at home? And we have to ask ourselves whether being locked up at home is indeed the right thing to be happening to us, as we understand the contours of this.
You said in the FT, and you mentioned that the essay you wrote for the Financial Times, and I urge people to check that out after this interview is over. You talk about the portal, you talk about the gateway, you talk about people trying to imagine a different future. Are you an optimist or a pessimist when it comes to working out where we are on the other side of this crisis? Is it the people who have seen the contradictions and the inequities of capitalism laid bare by this crisis, or is it the people who say, you know what, a crisis is an opportunity for us to double down on what we're already doing? Who wins that struggle?
See, Mehdi, I've been involved and with people who've been fighting with their backs to the wall for very, very many years to stop thinking in terms of optimist and pessimist, because people fight, whether we win or lose, we're not going to be on their side. We go down fighting or we win fighting, either way it's not a question of optimism and pessimism, because that isn't a choice that many people have. Maybe people who are in the middle classes have it, but a lot of people are just fighting for survival right now, and they don't have an option not to fight. So, but what I'm trying to say is that I find it so difficult to understand. On the one hand, you have this continuous reportage of this pandemic in which the mandarins use the language of war all the time, whereas wars are about killing people, not saving people's lives, which presumably is what they are trying to do in this pandemic. And we are worried about not having a drug and so on. And at the same time, that same set of people that same set of people is prepared to put, say, sanctions on Iraq, to deny people who are dying medicine that exists. A million people
Iran,
can die, and Iraq. I'm talking earlier about Iraq. When a million was said to have died, and Madeleine Albright said it's a hard price, but we think it's worth
paying.
So contained within this idea of saving people's lives is also the idea of annihilation, the idea of nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and this hurtling towards climate change. It is an acceptance of a kind of annihilation where coronavirus will be nothing compared to the chaos you'll unleash when you finish mining the last mountain and damming the last river and blasting the last ravine and digging up the last of the fossil fuels from this. Coronavirus will be like a toy, like a stuffed toy compared to what you're hurtling towards.
Yes.
So
it's a similar point. It's a similar point to what Noam Chomsky made last week when I spoke to him. He said, we are at the most dangerous moment in modern human history, and that's not because of the coronavirus, it's what's coming after, because the ice caps are not going to stop melting even when we have a vaccine for the coronavirus.
Exactly. And combine that with, for example, the fact that Kashmir is sitting on a flashpoint of a possible nuclear war. What is this Islamophobia and this demonizing of Kashmiris going to lead to in the future? It could lead to a situation which is out of control for everybody. So these things you have to pay attention to.
When I interviewed you early last year, we talked about how the Congress party in India, the center-left party that had dominated politics in India since independence until the rise of the BJP, how it had its own awful record, but it was still in some ways preferable to the BJP, which is a party rooted in fascism. Right now here in the US, some on the left are having that intense debate ahead of the presidential election in November. Yes, Trump is an awful leader, they say, but you can't vote for a neoliberal warmonger like Joe Biden, the former vice president. I had Noam Chomsky on this broadcast last week, as I mentioned, and he said he's going to hold his nose and vote for Biden in November because he's the lesser of the two evils on offer. Where do you stand on this whole debate on the left? Do you have to vote Congress over Modi, no matter how bad Congress is? Do you have to vote for a Democrat over Trump, no matter how bad the Democrat is? Where do you stand?
Well, I'd say that, a few years ago, I would have perhaps, maybe because I was younger or maybe because the situation wasn't so bad, I might have veered towards that. I have actually veered towards that purist position. But right now, I do think that Trump has to be, removed. And if I had to, I would vote for anybody but the Hindu nationalists here, whoever it was, and I have. So yeah.
And one last question to you. A lot of people watching India and watching, Narendra Modi's government. Modi makes Trump look mild in terms of both his record, bloodstained record, and in terms of the ideology of the BJP and the RSS group behind it. This is a man with an actual neo-fascist ideology rooted in, the time of the Nazis and the Italian fascists. Donald Trump doesn't have that kind of ideology. He obviously, He obviously promotes
the
white
ideology.
nationalists. Yeah, I'm just wondering, when you look at Modi, sorry, let me just ask the question. What advice do you have for people watching India and seeing how bad Modi is, but not knowing what to do? What can people around the world do to support the struggle of people fighting for democracy, equality, justice, anti-racism, anti-fascism in India?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, you know, it's been hard to even communicate what has been going on in India for so many years, because everybody just, you know, thinks, oh, Bollywood, yoga, Gandhi, cuddly toy, you know, like this messy, shambling democracy, isn't it beautiful? But when you actually try and show them what caste is, what Hindu nationalism is, what class is in India, you know, for example, the caste system is the most brutal, hierarchical arrangement of society, I think, in the world. And it's not human, it's supposed to be divinely ordained. So the master race is the Brahmin, and then you have the untouchable. So how easy it is to shift from there to a fascist position where you accept the idea of a master race. It's already there, you know. So I would just say, first, people have to understand it and pay attention to what's going on. Drop those old ideas, you know. So there are many people in India standing up to this, fighting this. It's not just some lone writers or something, you know.
And people from across the political spectrum and across the religious spectrum, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, atheists, a lot of people standing up.
All Hindus are not Hindu nationalists, you know. I mean, December, January, February was one of the most beautiful outpourings of poetry and art and support for the idea of a secular, diverse nation. You know, it was beautiful here, and in those few months before everything has been locked down and locked away. And while it's being locked away, these arrests are being made, and things are being, it's being made sure that when the lockdown ends, the protests don't erupt again, because those laws are all still in place. But I think the world is beginning to understand that it's not what it used to be. This country, you know, it's changed, and it's a dangerous place.
No, it's very sad to hear some of the stories coming out of India. And as you mentioned, it's a dangerous place. So Arundhati, please do take care of yourself, not just because of the coronavirus, but I know some of the threats and intimidation you get for speaking out like this, and we do appreciate it. And we do always thank you for taking time out to speak to me, both on this show, on my podcast, and elsewhere. Keep speaking out, and please do be safe. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you all for tuning in to watch. Thank you to Arundhati for coming and enlightening us. Please do keep watching these live broadcasts as we are in this lockdown. Do listen to my podcast, Deconstructed, which will be out later this week. And do consider becoming a member of The Intercept to support the journalism that we do. Otherwise, I hope you're safe, you're well, you're indoors, and I hope to see you soon. Goodbye.